Alright, good morning and welcome to the BronyCAN Fanfiction panel. This is the second year in a row we've had one, so for those of you who were here last year, welcome back. To everyone else, welcome. Before I explain how this panel is going to work, I'd like for us to take a moment to introduce ourselves. My name is Tony Genovese. I go by GaryOak on Fanfiction.net. I'm a pre-reader for the Royal Guard and a creative writing student at university. I began writing 3 years ago thanks to having an idea for a Friendship is Magic story. Since then, I've handed in both episode scripts and fanfiction as homework for university classes, and they, along with some original fiction, contributed to me winning a fiction award from my school. I also ended up getting a VA from the series to read a fanfic starring her character, and she loved it. My notable works include my novel, Repercussions, A Feather in Her Cap, Twilight Sparkle's Not-So-Secret Shiptych folder, a crossover of MLP and Tommy Wiseau's The Room called The Barn, and my upcoming novella, Diamond of Desire. I've also edited a few works including Wildfire and Biblical Monsters. I'm sorry. Now, speaking of Biblical Monsters, allow me to introduce its author, my editor, mentor, Bachelor of Arts in Creative Writing, and partner in crime, Horse Voice.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for attending. Yes, I'm afraid I am Horse Voice, and I am the horrible, awful, terrible person who wrote Biblical Monsters. If you wish to throw rotten fruit, please refrain from doing so until the panel is concluded.
Can I really come back to that?
You'll see me running the other way. Well,
I won't throw fruit at you. I've read the story. It was good.
Thank you. Well, aside from that dubious honor, I do have a few credentials. A few of my works have been published on both Equestria Daily and the Royal Guard. I'm one of the few people to have gotten into the Pony Fiction Vault twice, and Monsters made it into the Royal Cantor Library, so now I've peaked and now it's all downhill from here. Has been, but yeah, so thanks again for coming. Great to see you all.
And last but not least, he has more popular acclaim than both of us combined. It's a guy with a misleading name. It sounds like ponies.
I mostly write high fantasy and long romance fics on Fanfiction. I wrote Flying High, Falling Hard, Let's Find You a Date, and Equestria from Dust are probably my most notable ones. I'm also currently a writer for Horse Game, which is having a panel later at the con, which is a video game, fan game, a bit like a Zelda game. Aside from that, yeah, I'm in the top 50 most followed on Fanfiction. I've been posted to Equestria Daily a bunch of times. I have a couple stories with over 30,000 views on the first chapter, and I'm in the, yeah, I'm getting posted to the Royal Cantor Library soon.
Yeah, Equestria from Dust, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, how this panel is going to work, basically we're going to be talking about the evolution of a story. The impromptu name I came up for it was called Fanfiction, from inception to implementation. So we're going to be breaking this down into 5 sections. Each section will be 15 minutes long. It'll be mostly lecture. We'll try and take some questions, but if you do have a question, make sure it's completely relevant to the topic. Otherwise, we'll have to go ahead. Fortunately, though, this panel is going to be running a bit longer than 1 o'clock because of scheduling changes, so we will have more time for open Q&A. The way this is slated is about 10 to 1, we should be able to open this, open the floor up here, so that's really good. And yeah, so let's just plow ahead and talk about ideas. It's ideas, the process of coming up with a story, you know, how they're formed, originality, and combining popular concepts. When I say combining popular concepts, I mean, this is actually inspired by something you said, and it got me to think about it. Do you want to elaborate on?
Well, something I do a lot when I'm trying to come up with story ideas is you just sort of take 2 very popular and well-known things and combine them, which a lot of times can get you an original story, or you also put your own spin on it. And a good example of that, I think, is George R.R. Martin referred to Game of Thrones as Sopranos meets Middle-earth. So that was sort of where I took that from. And a lot of my stories have been sort of inspired by a combination of 2 to 3 works. I try to keep a sort of strong inspirational base, and that gives me a lot to work with when I'm coming up with the ideas for my stories.
Yeah, because one thing you need to know is that ideas, nothing is formed out of thin air. Everything is derivative in some way, shape, or form. Like if you look at Lord of the Rings, there are so many different things that Tolkien borrowed from and took from all these different mythologies, different stories, everything, and he combined it, but he did it in such an original way that it came out as not only an original work, but it defined the fantasy genre itself.
Everyone else borrows from him now.
Yeah, everyone else steals from Tolkien, so that's the thing, everything comes from somewhere.
Oftentimes, when creative people are asked, where do you get your ideas, they're tempted to come up with something sarcastic, because the question itself is wrong. It's not so much a matter of going out and getting ideas as if there were some physical place you could actually go and get them. It's about the ideas coming to you. You have to be ready to receive them when they arrive. Grab them and hold on to them with your mind. One of my favorite authors growing up, Roald Dahl, always kept a notepad and pen handy, or something that he could write with. Because if he was out driving and an idea came to him and he tried to remember it, he would have forgotten it by the time he got home. You can also learn, as you develop artistically, learn to take steps to put yourself in the right sort of headspace for receiving ideas. I myself, here's the eccentric writer stereotype, like to go for long walks on the beach in the middle of the night with very loud music in my ears. For some reason, I get so many ideas just doing that. And now, Soundslik actually disagrees with me about the business of writing things down. You know, he says it's like a filter, and the bad ideas, the forgettable ones, are the ones you'll forget and you'll remember the good ones. And really, neither of our approaches is the right one. You have to figure out what's right for you, because every creator is different.
Yeah, everyone who writes sort of takes a different approach to it, and it's about finding the approach that fits the way your mind works, the way you come up with ideas, and the way that you want to write and what you want to write. Because certain stories can require a lot of planning and a lot of sort of coming up with ideas and structuring them beforehand, whereas other stories you can sort of just write by the seat of your pants a bit more easily. So it depends on what you want to write, what genre you want to write, and really just how your brain works and what clicks for you.
Yeah, and let's talk about just sort of what kind of ideas you want for fanfics, because if you're writing a fanfic about an OC or lesser known characters, there's a lesser chance a lot of people will read it on something like fanfiction. The reason why is, when I read fanfiction, I want to read more about the characters we know and love. Like, if I want to, you know, in fanfiction there's, what, 1,500 people on at least at any given time, and a percentage of those will want to read a Twilight story. So if you have a story about Twilight, you've just guaranteed some readers. Even if the main six aren't necessarily the focus of it. One tip I heard, I think this is also from Evan, is have the hook involving them. You need a good hook or a good initial conflict involving a main six character to get them into the story. That pulls the reader into your world. And once you've got them after a couple chapters, you're good.
Yeah, a lot of what I like to do when I'm coming up with ideas and writing them down, and when I was talking about that original hook, is that you really want to try to come up with the idea of a story that you think should have been written and should exist and should be like wildly popular, but doesn't exist for some reason. And when you find that sort of story and story idea, that's sort of where I found most of my success, is from writing stories that I think should be there, but they aren't, so I make them.
Especially if you write the sort of thing that you enjoy reading, because that creative love will show through in a subtle way, but a meaningful way.
Yeah, precisely. If I may just tangentize briefly, I've written the first draft of an original novel. Since I'm a writing major, I can't just hand in fan fiction for all my assignments. My professors would get a little tired of that, so did my peers. And what I did is, I just came up with this idea. I said, okay, this is the ending. I strongly advocate coming up with the ending as one of the first things you realize, like you figure out, so you have a direction to take your story. What I did is I came up with this ending, and I pitched it to Horsevoice actually. I said, okay, it's about this 12-year-old girl inside a dream, and this is the ending that she comes to realize, and I'm going to take elements from The Matrix and Inception and put them together. And how does that sound? And he said, yes, this has to be written. And I take it through my classes, and everyone says this is like one of the most original stories I've ever read, even though I borrow so heavily from The Matrix and Inception. She, when she realizes, like before she realizes she's dreaming, she snaps, and her big brother who's bullying her, she just Matrix punches him through 100 mirrors, and she's like, what did I just do? But that's straight out of The Matrix, and it works.
Worth noting is that it pays to be very well read. The more variety of stuff you read, the better off you will be. Because if you look at the work of, say, usually a teenager or someone in their early 20s, and I've been this guy, you can kind of tell what his influences are because he only has a handful of them. The more influences you have, stylistically, in terms of subject matter and what you know, the more you can mix and match, develop your own personal style instead of borrowing others. Although I should mention, imitating the styles of writers you like is a part of the first few years of learning, or actually this or any art form. So don't be afraid of doing that while you gradually find your own voice.
I don't even think I have a distinct voice yet, do I?
You're working on it.
Yeah, and I've
You're
been
learning, grasshopper.
at this 3 years.
Coming back a little bit to where I was talking about sort of not writing down ideas and just letting the good ones stick and the bad ones fall away. To sort of explain that a little bit more, I guess I just I wait a couple weeks after getting an idea, and if it's a good idea, I keep on thinking on it, and some of the ideas that I've waited that week and I've thought on, I've sort of realized after the honeymoon period was over, the first couple of days, that, maybe it wouldn't turn out to be such a good story. I should wait on another idea or something like that. So it's really important to sort of sit on things after writing, after editing, and just sort of let that honeymoon period dissipate until you can sort of get a good grasp on your idea and your story and figure out what it really is that it still needs or what you should be working towards.
Mm-hmm. I think the last little section of this segment here is coming up with an attractive hook. That's one of the most important things you can possibly do. As I said, you needed good endings already in mind, in my opinion, to work toward before you start writing. So you have a goal, you have a direction, but you need a hook. I think the first sentence is the most important sentence in your entire book because that will determine whether or not people will read your story. If your first sentence is uninteresting, it just, I'm just going to put the book down and read something else, and you need to pull them into something good. Also, back jackets are really important. Do you remember the back jacket for Name of the Wind? Because that was a really fantastic book.
Yeah, it's about a man sat in a silence. There was a silence of 3 parts, and it goes on to describe what each part was. And it has an amazing line at the end about the third silence was the man's, and it was the silence of a cut flower waiting to die, or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Worth noting is that this is an art in and of itself, coming up with a good first sentence and a good first paragraph. Some of them you already know. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. The man in black fled into the desert and the gunslinger followed. There's a little Stephen King there. At 3:15 a.m., Adams woke me with a loud knock on my front door. Oh, no, that was my story, never mind.
Of course.
The sort of importance of a good first sentence, and to another extent, a good first paragraph, is that if you write those down, you can carry people for an entire page, or even pages, if it's a really good first sentence. Like, no matter what else you write for the next following pages, if the good first sentence is good enough, people will keep reading that far just because of that sentence.
Yeah, the thing is, your first sentence just has to do so much with so little. Like, you have to do a lot without looking like you're trying to do a lot. Because when you're really good at something, you'll make it look easy. That's a sign of a true pro. And I think you need to have a question raised, if possible, introduce a character or a setting or something like that. What are the other credentials for a good first sentence should have usually?
Well, it should have some mystery. Did you say that already?
Yeah, it needs to raise questions.
Raise questions, Who is the man in black? Who is the gunslinger? Why is it the best and worst of times? And pick up most famous novels out there. you'll see this. Once you start to look for these things and sort of dissect them in your mind as you read them, you start to see all these subtleties and nuances that you felt before as you were reading them, but didn't really think about because you were so caught up in these things. And this is sort of the best and worst thing about learning this art form, is you start to see more, but at the same time you can kind of see the strings a little bit as well.
Yeah, like learning how to read things critically has just ruined so much material for me. And as learning script writing, I can actually see the strings in a lot of, like when I watch Pony episodes, I go, oh, I can see this is the end of the act, this is what they're building to, da-da-da-da-da, this is how the conflict is and all that stuff. So it's just kind of neat. Like just saying, oh, this episode is written as a sitcom. For example, Tradia, that's like a classic sitcom structure.
On the other hand, one of the good things is that you can start to see, wow, that was a masterful plot hook right there. Or, there's a masterful teaser or stinger right there. And you can start to admire these things from the creator's point of view as well as the consumer's.
Sometimes what you can really start to admire, when you really get to know the strings, I think the most impressive thing is when someone tips them over on their head and does something that you've never seen before that you didn't even know could be done. I think that's something that's really precious that you only really get once you have a really deep understanding of the medium and storytelling.
It's even better if you find yourself pulling it off yourself.
Yeah, I try for that.
Yeah, breaking the rules.
But as far as hooks go, you're talking about raising questions, and there's something I've sort of realized with my writing over time, is that all writing carries a sort of ratio between information given and questions raised. And I think what an aspect of a good hook is that it gives a lot of information in few words and raises a lot of questions in very few words. And the combination of those makes you feel like this story is going somewhere, and also there's still so much to be discovered. Because if you only have one or the other, then it just isn't quite as good.
I guess this is a bit of a tangent, but it's kind of related to that, is when you're a new writer, you're probably going to underwrite, and you're just not going to, because you just aren't used to it yet. Those are muscles you haven't worked. Like, I can't go to the gym and bench press 300 pounds. Like, look at me. I can't do that because I don't even lift. So mentally, it's the same thing with creative writing, especially if you're trying to write a book. And then you start to overwrite because you're like, okay, this needs to be there, this needs to be there, and you actually know it needs to be there, and your story is just full of fat. And then when you get better, you start learning how to implicitly write, and that's how you cut the fat off. And you're like, okay, this sentence says this, even though it doesn't actually say it on the page, but you can easily infer it, and that is kind of the technique you need to put to extreme use when it comes to hooks.
Worth noting is there are I've observed two general kinds of bad writing: overwriting and underwriting. Because with underwriting, people will be trying to read it and they'll be wondering, what's going on here? There's no description. Everything just barrels along at a breakneck pace. I don't know, is this guy going over here? What? If it's overwritten, you'll bore the audience to sleep with these long descriptions, stories that go nowhere, 10 adjectives in a sentence where 3 would do, and on and on and on. Somewhere in the middle there's a happy medium. And that's a big part of learning this particular art.
Yeah, like I could write a whole paragraph on this glass of water, but unless it was involved with the Discord song Glass of Water, I don't think any of you guys would care. Oh, you would care? Okay, yes, you would care. That about wraps up the ideas portion of it. Since we have a little bit more time, does anyone have idea-related questions before we barrel along to our next one? Yeah, over there.
Me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I've heard it said before that I've heard advice to the effect of you should learn all the basics before you try and turn them on their head. Do you guys believe in that, generally speaking?
Yeah.
I've heard some people talk and say you don't have to do that, and other people say you should.
You absolutely have to do it.
Yes.
The thing about, I think, writing rules in general is the reason that they're called rules and they're sort of forced on beginner writers so much is because for the longest time you should just follow them. And it's as you continue writing and you get more experience, you learn how they work and when to break them.
So, quick follow-up. So, this is going to sound like a really dumb question, but at the very, very basic level, where would someone try to find those basics? Because it's almost like it's so simple you can't actually find that information.
Oh,
You're
okay.
just expected to know it.
I can recommend a bunch of books to you guys. This was going to be later, but since you brought it
Okay,
up
no,
right now,
it's coming
I'll
there.
recommend it right now. The Bible, like the rules Bible is the elements of style. I recommend learning that back to front. It's really short. There's no excuse not to read it. Virtually every book I've read on writing says go read Elements of Style. It's been around since 1918 and it's been revised and revised. It's just punctuation rules, grammatical structure, and all that sort of thing. It's like,
It's free on Amazon.
yeah, and
You
it's,
can get it that way.
yeah, you can find it all over the internet. Other books I would recommend are Eat, Shoots, and Leaves by Lynn Truss, Stephen King's On Writing. It was the best of sentences, it was the worst of sentences, recommended by him, and I echo that, having read it myself. I think that's all I can think of for writing books. You guys have any others?
As far as it was the best of sentences, it was the worst of sentences, I find it's probably one of the best places for real beginner to go, because I even learned things from it after having written for about 1.5 years at the time, but it's just amazingly digestible as far as this sort of reading goes.
Yeah.
It was like effortless to read all the way through it, which was amazing. It kind of shows that the person knows what they're talking about in terms of writing sentences.
It just makes you think of sentences so much differently, and if you look at a story, story as like a chemical composition, if I can go into chemistry a bit here, it's made up of smaller particles. Like, for example, a novel is made up of particles which are chapters, and those chapters are made up of scenes, and those scenes are made up of paragraphs, and those paragraphs are made up of sentences. And if your sentences are good, it will have a systemic effect. If you have good sentences, your paragraph should be good, and it will expand all the way until you have a good book in terms of just mechanical.
Let me tell you something right now. Oftentimes people come up to me, beginners, absolute beginners, and ask for writing advice. And I tell them, okay, here's your first assignment. Read these 3 books, and then write me a story not exceeding 10,000 words, demonstrating what you've learned from those 3 books. I hate to say it, but that eliminates 99.9% of people. This is one of the exceptions.
Yep, I listened and helped.
One thing I'd say though about as we're going over books to read and researching on how to write, I would say don't necessarily overread before actually doing writing, because otherwise you can get caught in the trap where your writing is just underwhelming for the longest time. And sometimes it's better to sort of, you have a lot of time, work through the content slowly, and make sure that you are practicing actual writing as you go along.
Yeah, when you're writing, I advocate focusing on 1 or 2 things to get better at. So if your comma usage sucks when you're writing, you say, okay, I'm going to make sure every comma is correct while I write this as best I can. And I will refer to the elements of style and online and all that stuff and just keep going. And then once I have a grasp on that, I'll look at my next weakest point and just keep hitting them like that. And after a few months, you'll find out what you used to be strongest at will be your weakest, so you have to go and improve that. Maybe we could take another question for you. You had your hand up, right?
Yes. Simplicity. Is that a good thing to have in a story? Not have it overcomplicated stuff. Like, if the story is like really convoluted and stuff, it's better to have a really simple story where the reader can understand it. Is that better?
It depends. Start with the simple stuff and work your way up.
Yeah,
Okay.
I definitely advocate for starting with being very bare bones in your writing in terms of style, in terms of using fancy diction and sentences. Start bare bones and build on that from there, in my opinion.
Or simple concepts. It's
Yeah.
things that you don't get confused very quick. Really
Yeah.
easily. Okay.
We'll take 2 more questions. You had your hand up.
My question is, what is exactly style? Because I never quite heard a definitive answer that made any sense.
What exactly is style?
Do you mean individual author's style or the...
Just writing style
writing
in
style
general,
in
because they
general.
always talk about it, but I just don't know what
Maybe
it
it
is.
means like purple prose versus beige prose. That kind of thing.
Yeah,
Style is sort of an amalgamation of diction, the way you construct sentences, and yeah, basically all the mechanics of the author and how they choose. I mean, there's hundreds of ways to present information, and how the author chooses to do it is sort of some reflection of their style, I guess.
and then there's also personal style as well. And the best definition I heard of that comes from Bad Horse, actually, who's quite well known in the since the pony writing world is something like a small town. Everyone knows everyone, at least by reputation. And one thing he said, which struck a chord, is that an author's individual style is usually the product of his limitations. He's doing what he's good at and avoiding what he's not. I said, oh no, say it isn't so, man. Because I have a very distinctive style. That's bad news. So, yeah, don't be afraid to experiment with different individual styles. Again, I must repeat this.
Yeah, I've written a lot of different types of stories, and those different types of stories force different styles. Like, I can't write a comedy in the same, like I can't like write a dark story in the same style I write a comedy story. It just doesn't work. And I've written dark comedy, slice of life. Cam, did you have your hand up, or are you?
I was going to quickly ask was, as far as the starting sentence goes, I've heard different things on this.
Yeah.
Should you avoid or can you at times use a question as your starting sentence?
It's risky.
And it can, but like I was saying earlier, like there is a place where any rule can be broken, more or less.
Another risky thing that one of my professors said is starting your story with dialogue. That is risky, but it can work. You had your hand up too, right?
The thing is, most stories these days, including real fanfiction, also real life, they tend to have blurbs or summaries, short summaries in the front
Yep.
of it. Therefore, the first sentence rule doesn't really so much apply to the first sentence of your actual story than to your actual summary's first sentence. So how would you actually create the summary? Would it be the same principles apply to the summary as well the first sentence?
Definitely. I'd say for like every sentence in the summary should be like a first sentence in your novel as well. Because I mean, that's what people are going to read. They're going to make them click through to your story. So what I try to do for summaries is I just try to overload that information and questions into every sentence as much as I can. I try to stuff as much information, as many questions raised as I can into as few words as possible.
Yeah, it's actually a bit of an art form, because you have to really just make sure you're going to pull people in. Like the story I'm working on, I'm still working on the jacket. Like I call it the back jacket, because it's like, you know, when you flip the book over and you see a paragraph on the back, that's called the back jacket, and that's what I refer to the long description on Fanfiction as. The story I'm working on is called Diamond of Desire, and this isn't done yet. Like, I still have to make this better. But what I have right now is something like, on a quest to win Rarity's heart, Spike attempts to find the most perfect gem in all of Equestria. And no ordinary gem will do, it has to be the best diamond he can find. But he does not find what he seeks, it finds him. Hopefully that's good, but it's not good enough. I have to do more with that. So I advocate writing the back jacket really early for your story and revising it along with the story revisions, and it'll get better and better because it's so important.
On rare occasions, even a short passage from the story itself works well as a back jacket. I did that with Monsters, and it worked. That guy stood at was at the top of the heat chart on Fanfiction for like 3.5 days, which kind of blew my mind.
And then you did it again with a different story, and people were like yawn past.
Yeah,
because
it can be risky, I admit, but sometimes it works.
Yeah, I've had back jackets that just go because I didn't know. I didn't know my lesson. So
yeah,
we got a little bit over. So now we're going to go into preparation. We may have covered this already, so there's a bit of bleeding. Like the one thing I want to cover first is: are you a gardener or are you an architect? I believe this is another George R. R. Martin thing. Sorry for stealing from you so much, sir. Gardener is, you only go in with the bare minimum amount of information before you start writing. You basically say, okay, this is who the story's about, this is the character, this is the ending, these are a couple key plot points. Go, write novel, make words happen. And then there's architect, who, as you would expect, every last rivet is accounted for in your story. You plan out, like, have you ever seen people write all these stories on color-coded flashcards? And that's basically what you do, and that's actually advocated if you're writing mystery, by the way, even if you're not an architect. You basically say, okay, scene 1, character A, character B, character C, plot line, da-da-da-da-da, and you have like 6 different cards, and you just make this big matrix of them. And then you have pages upon pages of notes, backstories, other stuff that just doesn't even come close to being shown in your story, but it's there and it's in your head. You have to plan a lot if you're an architect. Some people function better that way. I personally don't. But
and it may depend on the type of story you're writing as well. Mine often hinge upon twists, and And so a twist has to be foreshadowed and set up just right, otherwise it'll just kind of leave people wondering, you know, well, what the heck was that, sort of thing. And recently I've been criticized for going overboard. It's like, wow, this guy piles the foreshadowing on with a snow shovel. So there is very much so to speak. So there is such a thing as too much. It's hitting that happy medium, and you don't want people to guess the twist either. But you do want to raise questions. A story of this kind, it should be, like, the best kind of story is one where you didn't see the ending coming the first time, but if you go back and reread it again, you see, okay, there is no other way this could have ended.
Case in point, Harry Potter. Pretty much every Harry Potter book. Like, one of my favorite examples of this is Goblet of Fire. That the twist with, you know, the whole Alistair Moody twist. If once you know that and you reread it, you're just like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, this is just genius.
A good twist is Fight Club.
I actually can't talk about that, but I haven't seen it.
I won't have spoilers, but that is
If anyone's seen
that is a good twist. You know, the twists that come at the you know, sometimes twists will come at the very end, and sometimes they'll come about 3/4 of the way through the where if this were a 3-act play, it would be transitions between second and third act.
Yeah, the climax.
Where there's, you know, the twist comes and then there's your third act, your payoff, and your denouement. And sometimes, if you're writing very short horror stories, I like to call them scorpion stories because they're short and ugly and they have a stinger at the end. And the twist comes when you've got that stinger. My second pony story, The Writing on the Wall, got into the Pony Fiction Vault. The whole thing was set up on a twist that is revealed on the very last page. And this was an example of architecture because everything had to be planned out just perfectly. And so many people, when they got to that last page, said, oh, why didn't I get that? Why didn't I understand that before it came along? It's like, so many people were like, oh my God, that was so creepy. I had to turn the lights on, sleep in the nightlight after I read that twist there. It's like, so it's like, yeah, gotcha.
Cowards. I did that. I just said, oh, this is good.
So these are just examples, of course.
As far as being a gardener, I have quite a bit of experience from that, having done 2 very long fics in that style. Both of them romance, actually. And I think that's one example of a really good place where writing by the seat of your pants and sort of keeping planning a bit loose works really well, where it's a really character-driven story rather than plot-driven. So it's more about, you can have the characters turn and do whatever makes sense in the context, rather than having everything feel like it's on a set course. That can bring a lot of organic interaction between the characters and the plot.
Yeah, for my non-pony novel, which is about 63,000 words now, the first draft, I only had about 1.5 pages of this, and that was all my outline. And it was basically chapter, name, 1 or 2 sentences describing chapter, and that's it. And that's all I had to refer to. So then when I got to that chapter, I'm like, okay, characters in, go. And how are the characters going to do it? Like, I kind of like sat and asked myself, okay, characters, how is this going to play out? Lead me through the story, please. And that's basically what I did.
Yeah, sorry, are you guys going to talk about character creation later on at all? Just out of curiosity.
I don't think we're going to cover that too much, but you can ask, especially, like, we're going to have open floor questions too, so. Yeah.
One thing that can throw you off if you're trying to be an architect and lends itself more to gardening is once you've got a character and you've written that character enough, that character takes on a life of its own and it starts doing things that you hadn't planned on, especially in longer stories. So that's a good sign because it means you're getting a feel for it. But also be prepared for this thing to spin out of control, and also this is why second drafts are so important too.
We'll be talking about that later too, believe me.
In long stories where you do a lot of architect work, you wind up writing the first couple chapters, and then the characterization of one or more of your characters winds up not being exactly what you had originally planned, but you found something a little bit off the mark that works really well, so you're going with it. And that can cause you to have to go back and change a lot of things because certain elements of the story don't work out. Like if you make this bad guy who's actually, somewhat justified and has a more strict moral code than you had maybe originally planned, then you could have to go back and have him not be senselessly violent or something like that.
And to elaborate a little bit more on the preparation, there's also, you have to know what research you have to do for your story before you do it. And, you know, research, note-taking, that's really important. Like, for example, like writing on the wall, you had to do a ton of research on that. And yeah, you explain that.
One of the reasons why I release a new story about Once in a Blue Moon is that there's a long development process. The research phase alone may take weeks. Because a lot of the real world, I have a very gritty style, so a lot of stuff from the real world gets put into my stories. And oftentimes when I ask people for advice, they'll come up with solutions to plot problems that involve fantastical situations, but counterintuitively, I usually try and keep fantastical things to a minimum. By the way, let me tell you right now, if you're trying to do this as even as a hobby, you're not too good to do research. As soon as I say the word research, to so many people who ask me for advice, their eyes just glaze right on over. And it's like, well, are you serious about this or are you not? And I'm getting a few certain stares right now, I think. But yeah, you'll be glad you did, because A, you'll learn new things, and that's always good. And B, you might get into the Pony Fiction halls of fame like I do.
Like, if you want to write a story about a pirate ship, you better darn well know how pirate ships work. You know, like all the ropes and the sails and all that stuff, and the names for everything,
and the superstitions, you know.
And like you need to know all that. If you wrote a story without knowing that, some people who are equally ignorant would be like, okay, it's good. Then someone who actually knows what they're talking about, like, you didn't do any research, did you? This story is not believable at all. That'll just destroy their suspension of disbelief, and your story will get a dislike.
Not to mention, of course, if you show your work, and it's correct, you'll challenge people a little bit, and they'll learn something, which is always nice. You know, people usually appreciate that. And B, it makes the world you've created feel more alive, because you've got some depth there. It looks kind of lived in, feels kind of lived in, I should say. Because, you know, you're inhabiting, you have to paint a vivid picture in people's minds. You know, you're not drawing. You're using sort of what Stephen King calls a form of telepathy. You've got an image in here, and you've got an image you're trying to form in readers' minds, and you have to use words to try and do that. Try and paint a vivid picture in their minds, and research is an aspect of that.
That just made me think of that scene from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you know, where the original one, where they transported the bar into the television. Yeah, that, like, think of it kind of like that. You've got your idea, and it gets broken down into, you know, millions of little particles, and those are like the character, like the letters in your story, and they have to form vividly in the other person's head.
On the flip side of that kind of research, a lot of what the research I do for my stories is like I was saying, that I usually draw from specific inspirations for my stories. I go back and I watch and I rewatch or read and reread those over and over, and I sort of try to get immersed in the vibe and atmosphere and things that they created, and try to really understand how all their elements work and figure out how to mesh two or more elements into cohesion.
Are we about ready to move on to drafting then? Because we've talked a lot about preparing, and we should talk about just going. So, drafting. This is an important thing, because if you don't draft, you're not going to get your story written. Because to write, like, you know, you're writing, say, a 150,000 word story, think about how many words do you write a day on average. And when you think of it now, you're like, wait, it's going to take me how many months to get the first draft of the story done? And you really need discipline to keep it up. Stephen King advocates a book should take no longer than one season to first draft. So that's 3 months. So you have about 90 days. And in order to do that, sometimes you're going to have to write, you know, thousands of words a day. Most professional writers write about 1,000 a day. Stephen King writes 2,000. This summer I wrote about 1,500 words a day for pretty much the whole season, and I got over 100,000 words on the page. And the way you do that is you have to just focus, like get up every day and say, I'm going to write this much, regardless. I don't care how bad I slept, I don't care how bad I feel, I don't care about my mood, I don't care if I had a big fight with one of my friends on Skype the other day. I just have to sit down, clear my mind and write it. Sometimes you have to meditate, just do whatever rituals you have to do. Have your coffee, do whatever, just sit down, write. That is the important thing.
Yeah, speaking of rituals, there's never underestimate how easy it is to trick your brain, because there's lots of those stupid little brain games you can do to motivate yourself to write. You know, if you don't hit your mark of 750 words written for the day, do 10 push-ups. You'll get writ or you'll get fit. So, one I did for a while when I was having this problem, I think Eric Glass had a really good quote on it, but it's, you have a problem for the longest time when you start writing or doing art or any sort of creative medium where you know what's good and what you do isn't good. And it's really hard to sort of continue on when what you're doing doesn't look good. So I sort of tricked my brain into thinking I am good by telling myself I look beautiful in the mirror every morning. I walked around with a lot of I faked confidence for a really long time while having this inner crushing doubt. And eventually it sort of fleshed out and it's sort of real confidence now. I've gotten happy with my writing. It took years, but I'm finally at a place where I'm happy with my writing. And it's about tricking yourself into doing things until they become habit and until they become real. Fake it until you make it is very powerful.
Yeah, and Stephen King likened reading to sleeping, or writing to sleeping. You know, if you're more inclined to have a good, healthy sleep cycle if you go to sleep at the same time every day and wake up at the same time every day, and you just have that habitual. You have to treat writing like that. And you also need, even if you're a hobby writer, you need to treat writing like a job and take it that seriously in order to really get good production going. And another thing to keep in mind here is sometimes when you're writing, you always freeze. You're like, oh, how are people going to react to this? Or how do I phrase that and whatnot? You need to just get those inner critics out of your head because they are poison most of the time. The method here is another Stephen King thing. It's called writing with the door closed. When you write with the door closed, that is your first draft. It is written for you. Nobody else. You don't have to show a soul. And if you do, that's up to you. You do not open the door until you are beginning your second draft. And that's when you write for, when I write first draft, it's for me. When I write my second draft, it's for you guys. Yes?
Speaking about writing your first draft and writing every day, what if you're too busy or stuff? I heard there's people who have a mini recorder or even their phones, and they just, as they're working or something, they'll just record their ideas, and then when they get home, they hear it and they write. Is that a good method?
Whatever works for you.
Allow me to say that this is another case where one size does not necessarily fit all. That might be a good technique for some people, and it really depends on your life. Let's face it, a lot of us are going home to day jobs, and sometimes those jobs are exhausting, and sometimes you just don't feel like it. But on the other end of the spectrum, with Stephen King at one end, at the other you would probably find James Joyce, a very classic, famous author, who, legend has it, would agonize for hours over a single sentence trying to get it just right. And he would consider it, legend has it, a good day if he could write just the perfect sentence. Now obviously not all of us are going to be Stephen King, not all of us are going to be James Joyce. Most people are going to be somewhere in the middle there. Start with realistic goals, I think, and work your way up. And play around with it, Figure out what's good for you, because everyone's mind is a little different.
When you can, just focus on output, because honestly, think about this. 1,000 really trash words are better than 0 perfect words at the end of the day. You have something on the page, and it's a lot. And once you actually have something, you can work with it and shape it and improve it. Because you have infinite shots at the goal, as it were, when it comes to writing. You don't have one attempt unless you're in a time, like a contest or something, where you have 2 hours to write a story.
Yeah, as someone who's on their 3rd year of computer science at university, I'm learning, I do game dev in my free time, I'm trying to learn art, I write. I also play a ton of video games and watch a ton of movies, and it's sort of, a lot of it is scheduling. I mean, you can very easily work a pretty long hour job and still have plenty of time to write. It's just whether or not you're willing to schedule it in, and whether or not writing is something you want to schedule in. If at the end of a long day of work, you find yourself just unable to, or you can't find yourself writing, and you just want to watch TV or watch movies, then, I mean, that's sort of a decision you have to make in terms of what you're going to spend your time doing. So, you can't do everything, and you have to make choices about what you are going to do.
Yeah, and Stephen King's on writing, one example he gave is this one guy would write 3 hours every morning before he would deliver milk, and that was what he did. And it didn't matter what happened in those 3 hours. If he, with an hour and a half in, if he finished a novel, hour and a half in, you know what he would do? He would go, okay, new novel, page 1, go. And it would always be exactly 3 hours. Some people do it by time, some people do it by word count, like I will write no less than X a day. Some people like Graham Greene only do 500, so you can make it if you write only 500 a day. It just depends on like how many novels a year are you going to realistically write at, whatever pace you choose. And it's got to be something that you can sustain. It's got to be difficult but sustainable, because if it's too much, you'll burn yourself out. Like 5,000 words a day, yeah, good luck with that. Not many people can do that. Some people can. I don't know how, but I just don't have the mental capacity to do that.
If you ever meet Short Skirts and Explosions and confirm he's an actual human being and not like a team of people living in a basement, I would like to know.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, apparently that guy can just, I don't know, go crazy and write 8,000 a day.
There was a write-off over a weekend, and he wrote, it was anonymous, so no one had their names on the stories during judging, but there was one story that was 25,000 words long, so we knew who.
Yeah, to put it in perspective, he releases really long stories and really long updates to stories every now and then, but every single day he publishes a new chapter on his Imploding Colon account, which is 1,500 to 4,000 a day. So he writes that much on top of all of that, and these are like daily updates that have been going on for over a year. It's, I mean, the most prolific writer in the world wrote, what, like 100 million words? Yeah, 100 million published words. That's like the most prolific in history. So some people can do it. Some people can write like 1,000 novellas. I don't know how, but. So, do we have any more statements on drafting we'd like to talk about, or should we jump into revision? Does anyone have more drafting questions?
It's sort of in between drafting and revision.
Yeah.
How long should you wait between editing? Because I heard Stephen King said, wait a month before you even begin attempting editing your first draft.
Yes, we're going to talk about this in revision. Basically, it depends on the length of the story, but what you need to do, like the reason, like Evan touched on this earlier about the honeymoon period, when you're attached to a piece of work you recently wrote, you always will be because you made it. You can't see the flaws nearly as well as other people can. You think, this is perfect, I can't do any better. And this may be your maximum skill level at the time. But then you have to put it aside for a long time, then you start seeing the problems. Stephen King advocates 6 weeks or more for a book. For my novel, I've put it away for close to 2 months now, and I'm just about to start getting back into it. He recommends you take your whole story and read it in one sitting, even if it's a 150,000 word novel. You just sit down and read the whole thing at once, and just make notes as you read through it after you've put it away. And when you put it away, you have to push it out of your mind. Don't think about it, don't touch it, don't look at it, write something else if you can. I wrote like half a dozen stories in the interim between that.
Yeah, something I typically do is I have editors working for me. So what I typically do is as soon as I finish a first draft, I just send it off to them. My first drafts are pretty clean. Preferably clean up your first draft before sending it off to editors, but I haven't gotten any complaints. I just send it immediately off to my editors so that they can go through and comment things right away, and then I don't touch the comments for a while. And that way, there's not only a week or a month between when I wrote it and when I come back to the comments, but there's a week or a month between when I wrote it and when the editor comes back to it. So you wind up getting 2 sort of changed perspectives versus like first reading and second reading. I find that's something pretty useful, is not only seeing how you come back to it differently, but how a reader comes back to it differently.
One thing to keep in mind is that when you create something artistic, you're putting out a piece of yourself. You're putting some of yourself into what you create. And so when that is criticized, it's so easy, especially for a beginner, to take it personally. I used to be a very bad writer. You know, something of for my first couple of years at university, just the class is whipping boys, like, oh look, it's this idiot again. And they tore my work apart so much that in the first year at least, after every class, I would actually have the shakes, because they'd basically gone around a circle and told me how horrible I was. But it built character, got better over time, not perfect yet, but it helps to gradually get more and more criticism as you get better. And for goodness sake, don't take it personally. You know, constructive or not so constructive criticism, well, you know what to pay attention to you know, once you've learned how to tell those two apart. But understand that they are trying to make you better at the art. And, you know, this should go without saying, but it's so easy to take offense without thinking, especially if you've got a lot of stuff to work on. And rest assured, if you've never done it before, unless you're some kind of super genius like you're Charles Dickens or something, you're going to have a lot to work on at first, more than you can probably imagine. It's easy to write, you know, you learn it in school, but it's difficult to write well. But it's worth it in the end.
Something that I like to say a lot when telling other people about this, and also something I thought to myself a lot when I was learning, was that you are not your art. Which is, when you're starting out, like, what you write now is not in any way definitive of how you're going to grow as an author or what you will be writing down the line. So having what you've written now be criticized, it's not indefinite. I mean, it's going to change. Your writing is going to change. This is just some story you wrote now, and you are not your art. So when people insult it or criticize it, they're not insulting or criticizing you. It's just the particular piece.
Yeah, you're going to grow as a writer and a person like that. The first time he workshopped one of my stories, which was Repercussions, the first pages were pretty much drowning in blue ink from that pen. And then, later on through the story, at about chapter 19, I think it was, he handed me a page and said, look at this page, and there was not a single mark on it anywhere, because it was apparently, according to him, perfect.
It was.
Yeah.
No, that was and eventually, you know, once you get past that point and you start getting back these clean pages and you start getting compliments, you start to realize, hey, I'm getting better. And incidentally, you can test yourself to see if you're getting better, because if you look at stuff you wrote at least, let's say, 3 months ago, and you look at it and say, boy, is that ever crap, then you know you're getting better, because you're better than you used to be, and you're starting to see things that you could not see before. I've lost count of the number of horrible things I wrote in university, and now hopefully, I think I just hunted down, destroyed every last copy. I'm not sure.
Aside from the copies I have in my house.
Oh dear. Yeah.
If he steps out of line, then yeah, we're
he's gonna sell them back to me one at a time.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. The first story I wrote got really popular, and then people would go, "Oh yeah, you wrote that story. It was kind of awful." So I wound up going back and just deleting everything that was there and rewriting about 70,000 words to escape that.
Did it work?
Yes, sort of.
Oh, there you go.
Couldn't fix the plot.
Yeah, and you know, let me just say, it can be very discouraging when you look and you see people doing this really amazing fan work, and you compare it with your own stuff. Don't get, you know, professionally jealous, because that's self-destructive. It just breeds bad feelings, and you'll actually shoot yourself in the foot that way. A lot of the people who join this fandom and immediately start producing great work, and every type of art form there is, you know, this fandom has them, they just climb to the top of the charts immediately. They are inevitably people who had been doing it for years before ponies were ever a thing. Sometimes even as their jobs, you know, we've got a couple of professional writers.
Skywriter.
Augie Dog, you know. And I mean, Art's got that as well. You know, everyone knows the name John Ozeco. You know, maybe he was a professional illustrator first. So, yeah, you know, if you're starting there, don't compare yourselves to the people who have been doing it for 5 or more years, because they probably put in their 10,000 hours and become masters. So, you know, it's not a race. Just remember that.
Exactly. Now, to get into the revision part, since we've already been talking about that, let's clarify editing versus workshopping. Because you don't, like some people don't really know what workshopping is. I didn't until I started talking with him and then going to university classes, which is what they mostly are. Workshopping is when we print out, like say there's like 10 people and I print out 10 copies of my story, hand them to those people. They spend the week revising it, like looking at it and saying this is good, this is bad, here are your grammar mistakes, all that sort of thing. And then they prepare statements and they give you the marked up copies back and they go round table saying their opinions on your story, and you kind of get general feedback through that. You sit there with a notepad, just scrawling down as many notes as you can. You'll probably fill up a page or two. And you take that and then you edit it. So most of the time when you ask for feedback online, like especially if Google Doc comments, most of that's a workshop. There are, like, hardcore editing is, that's when changes are actually made. Like that's when you go, fix this, fix this, fix this. It's a lot more precise, I guess. That's like copy editing versus substantive stuff, and substantive is like, that's the feedback thing. Like, I felt this character was good, I felt this was a good moment, this moment was not good, this scene needs to be longer, this needs to be shorter. That's what you want to knock out in workshopping in your second draft before you start editing, as it were.
I've noticed that there seem to be, this is a personal theory of mine, there seem to be 3 types of personalities as regards to art. There's creators, consumers, and critics. And each looks at art differently. And the best kind of workshop is one that has all 3 personality types, because each has blind spots that the others do not. Even if the other person is not a writer, even if they're just somebody who likes picking things apart, or somebody who just reads for enjoyment, goodness gracious, if you don't have something that's enjoyable to read, for the masses, you may as well simply just write for yourself. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but if you're publishing in any format, including on the internet, you are at that point writing for someone else.
Sorry, I was actually going to ask a question about writing for yourself. Do you think it's maybe, for someone who's like really starting off, maybe to try and write something for themselves, not expect a lot of feedback, just to get used to the actual process of writing, and then start focusing on trying to write to an audience? Or is it probably better to just go straight to the audience and get all that feedback?
That's what all first drafts are. All first drafts are written for you. It doesn't matter how good you are at writing. All first drafts are for the author. And then when you revise, is when you open the door. You write with the door open. And when you write with the door open, that means you're letting the world in. You're letting the world see your stuff. And you're saying, okay, this new draft, this is for you, not me. It's not mine anymore.
I try not to write for myself exactly. I try to write what I would want to read. I think that's a lot better metric to go off of. Do you have a question?
I have a general question, because I've heard of creating stories by writing stories. I know there's some like connotations, but there's actually like really great writers that have encouraged from starting off with those and just getting from basic writing to more and more detailed as they went along. Any opinions on that?
I guess it's whatever helps you get better. I mean,
Finding an audience is really valuable. I sort of lucked out, but it also wasn't luck, I don't think, in the terms that my first story was popular. Having an audience and having a lot of feedback is really valuable. So, I mean, if you're not getting an audience with what you try on Fanfiction or something like that, but if you're going and writing green text stories and you are getting an audience, then feedback is really valuable. So, wherever you can get feedback, really.
yeah, I guess one other concise way for editing versus workshopping, just to like wrap up my thoughts on that, I would ask anybody here to workshop my story. If you wanted to workshop it, go ahead. Just throw any feedback you can at me, because the more perspectives, the better. Because if 2 people say this doesn't work, but that's out of 50, then I'm pretty sure it does, and that's just subjective with you guys. But editing, that's when I need to see credentials, and I don't have very many people actually edit my work, but I have dozens of people workshopping. The too many chefs in the kitchen type of thing.
Well, I personally have never heard of this business of green text stories. That's a new one on me. But everybody starts with a humble beginning, and it's not impossible. The important thing is to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. Really, you'll grow as an artist and eventually as a person.
Yeah, people ask Stephen King, how do you write your stories? 1 word at a time. That's how all stories are written. 1 word at a time. There's no wizardry there.
So are we about boundary revision? I feel like
I think so, because we talked about the gap, we talked about, like revision is really important, because don't publish first drafts to fanfiction, please, just don't. Because even if you're a fantastic writer and you can write amazing first drafts, you're still cheating yourself and the audience, because no matter how good your first draft is, your second draft can be better.
Yeah, there's one of the stories I wrote that's really long. I sort of like lost my editors, they went offline or whatever for a little while, and I just published a bunch of chapters, unedited first drafts. And I had a couple comments since then saying, you know, this is a great story, but it's kind of ruined or hindered by these errors I'm noticing. Just small mechanics, really.
It's a funny one, because Gary and myself, and actually I taught him this, are often, whenever we mention that we completely write a story out before starting to publish it, usually, people kind of look at us like, what? You know? And in the, actual publishing world, that is, of course, standard practice. You know, the days of serials are largely over. And, Charles Dickens may have done it, but, when I was writing Monsters, for example, I happened to mention, the whole thing is written. I just happened to mention it offhandedly, and someone said, what? Are you telling me that the whole thing is sitting on a hard drive somewhere just taunting me? It's like, what? I was surprised at his surprise. And we both have been at times like these, but I'm surprised that more people don't do this, because the result is so much better. You cut away so much of the fat, so to speak, and you can really set up some excellent moments, some real zings, when you get your timing just perfect. You build it and then you polish it, and that's so important.
Yeah, I mean, Repercussions, that's my first story. That's 151,000 words, and it took me a year from starting to write before any of it got published. But when it was published, finally, I had the entire thing first drafted, and I was about halfway through second drafting the story, and I released a chapter a week for months until it was finally done after 18 months of work. So yeah, I had the whole thing done, and then if ever you guys see Diamond of Desire come out, whenever that's done, it's been done for a few weeks already, the first draft. So when you see the first chapter come out, rest assured the other 5 are done and probably perfected. I'm just staggering the release. And I get weird looks at other panels when I say this. Like pen strokes, like, hey, stop making us look bad.
Which is funny, because usually it's people who say that to him. I must confess, sometimes I look at the Colden Gardizes and the Skywriters and so forth, and I think, I bet I could be that big, if I had enough time to write. These grapes are totally sour.
Says the guy who said don't get professionally jealous of other people.
I know. I don't do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, when it comes to revision, something I'd recommend a lot for any multi-chapter fic, which this is sort of more towards architect, but it's really good to have the first 5 chapters done before you publish the first, and then you can just stagger the release over fanfiction.
Yep.
But having those first 5 chapters done sort of gets you a really solid beginning. Even if you decide to, from that point on, when you catch up to right by the seat of your pants, just getting that beginning, the first several chapters all fleshed out and working coherently can be a huge boon when you're revising things. It's more that so much can change from when you first write the first chapter. Like as you continue writing chapters, things can change drastically in a multi-chapter story.
Yep.
So it's better to sort of get seeded and rooted into the story by having doing the first several chapters before you post the first. From there, you can write by the seat of your pants because you've sort of settled in.
By the way, I know we may be making this sound like a lot of work, but rest assured it is worth it. If if anyone becomes a better writer, and it is so important to be able to express yourself on paper, and it's kind of sad how badly, I should mention, the school systems teach this these days. That one of the great things about this fandom is that people actually come into it and they get better at it. Fanfiction is really great for that. There's so many groups so many people who will just drop in and give constructive criticism just 'cause. And I think that's a really valuable thing, so you'd be cheating yourself not to take advantage of it. And you know, even if you're not going to go professional, we're giving all this advice that, you know, professionals would give. It's so gratifying when you are able to kind of reach out and touch someone emotionally, or surprise them, or make them cry, or scare them, you know, I mean, people are telling, man, I read Monsters, I slept with a nightlight on for weeks, you know. It's times like these that make it all worth it.
Exactly. I think what drives a lot of creatives in general is you occasionally read or watch something that you really fall in love with, and it touches you in some way. It gives you some strong sense of fear, some strong sense of sadness or wonder, and feeling that, and then wanting to make other people feel it with your works is sort of a lot of where I get my drive, at least, for writing.
Yeah, I think that about covers revision. The last stage we are going to go into is marketing. When I say marketing, I don't mean it as in like, I mean marketing, but
presentation.
Presentation, yeah. So this is, now you've got your fic, you've done all this, you've actually written the thing and revised it, and it's perfect. Now, how do you get people to read it? And that's the important thing, because I've seen so many good fics on FinFic that have almost no views. I'm like, this is a crime. They're so well written. And then I've seen these stories. For example, there was a story about like a butler, and it recently in the feature box. That has 1,100. That got 1,100 upvotes, and I was one of the few people downvoted because I was like, okay, you don't even know how to punctuate dialogue properly. What are you doing? Seriously, no dialogue punctuation, and it's just. And part of that is marketing, because, for example, like it's partly part marketing. Like that Butler story had a good hook, good market, a good cover, and people read it. But maybe not so much for the other good fics that only have like a few hundred views and like 50 upvotes and no downloads, and that's it.
I think a lot of what happened with that story is that thing I was talking about, where it's a story that should exist that doesn't exist. Butler stories are sort of a huge thing in anime, and I think there's a lot of people in the fandom who like anime, so a story about a butler would be sort of close to home for a lot of people who read anime, I think.
I'm not an anime guy, but I wanted to read it because I'm a big Jeeves and Wooster fan, and I also like Artemis Fowl, and one of my favorite characters in Artemis Fowl is Butler. Yeah, you know Butler. Yeah.
I would say like that. I think that also pertains to like crossovers too, because people like the things that cross over.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you can dress up for uploads and quality because of that.
Yeah. And then again, if you cross over something more obscure, even if it's well written, it won't get as many views as a more popular thing to cross over with. So that's the thing. Just the concept of your story will give you views or take away views for free just because of its concept.
Speaking of crossovers, if you're going to publish on Fanfiction, how would you handle like introducing the other side or the other part that you're crossing over with?
I've only written one crossover, and that's, I don't know if that's a good example because it's, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with The Room by Tommy Wiseau. I did that with ponies and called it The Barn. Like, Shining Armor is Tommy Wiseau. Like, think of it that way. All I can say is, as a pre-reader for the Royal Guard, we actually have a crossover rule. And the crossover rule is, if a pony fan, and only a pony fan, can read it and understand it, we'll take it. But if it's too reliant on the other source material, we will automatically reject it for that reason, no matter how well it's written. For Fanfiction's crossover policy, ponies have to be present in the first chapter, and they have to be present enough. So I don't really know if that answers your question. I'm sorry, I can't answer it better.
It varies a lot from story to story and what you want to do, but I think the more, considering that where you're probably going to be posting this story is to Fanfiction, the more accessible you make the other side of the story for people who haven't read whatever you're crossing over with, the better, really. I mean, Fallout Equestria did a pretty good job in the sense that it was really accessible to someone who didn't know about Fallout. It explained everything as it went along, and it built the world from the ground up, sort of.
I want to say for a moment a word on titles, because titles are literally the first things that people see, and a lot of people tend to gloss this over. For a beginner fan fiction writer, there are certain cliches that he doesn't know are cliches. I recently figured out a quick and dirty way of getting rid of the worst of them. Alright, there's this band called Dragon Force. Look up their lyrics and their song titles. If the prospective title for your story sounds like a lyric or song title of Dragon Force, reject it. Go back to the drawing board, figure out something else. It has to, the title has to be interesting. I recently had a comment from, you guessed it, Biblical Monsters again, the story that won't leave me alone. The guy says, man, normally I hate stories with the human tag, but I saw that title and it grabbed my attention. And once you've got that, there's got people's attention with the title. There's also the cover image, and you can commission them. Eventually, if you get enough fans, you can even ask them to do it for free, which blows my mind, if they're good enough. But heck, the one for Monsters, I just did a search for Alicorn Twilight, and I found a picture that just looked really ominous, and that was perfect, and it sort of became iconic. I don't know if the artist is even in the fandom anymore, or if he or she knows this image is attached to such an infamous story. But, by the way, that one being my big hit, by the way, I cheated a little bit, because that story was blatantly about controversial subject matter. And controversial subject matter grabs people's attention.
Yep.
So someday, I plan on making my big comeback. I'm going to be talking about religion again. Head for the storm shelters, folks. It's going to be a bad one. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Be warned, there may be flame wars.
Yeah, like with the title thing, my rookie mistake, like repercussions, that's not that good of a title. Like when you think about it, it's fitting, but it's accurate, but it's not good. Hopefully Diamond of Desire sounds a bit better than that, but it's just, because that's actually a pretty fitting thing. So you gotta have a title that says a lot but doesn't say much at the same time.
Do you guys believe in chapter titles, or do you prefer to go chapters 1, 2, 3? I think people do both, and some people can make it work really well.
I've done both. I mean,
I do different chapter naming schemes depending on the story. There was for Equestria from Dust, I think every chapter title was like a single word. Like there was a chapter called Forest, there was a chapter called Life, and etc. etc. Whereas for other stories, I would maybe even make the chapter naming convention similar to the way I named the title. Like, let's find you a date had an exclamation mark in the title, and it was very uppity. So all the following chapter titles also had an exclamation mark and sort of followed that title convention.
By the way, these days, short, pithy titles are in fashion. That doesn't necessarily make them better. The winningest science fiction writer in history, Harlan Ellison, was a master at longish titles that really grabbed your attention. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Repent Harlequin, said the TikTok man. Demon with a Glass Hand. I don't even know what that last one's about, but I want to read it. Yeah. So think about that too.
Yeah, so the cover image and the title, they both need to be good. And one thing you need to think about with cover images is look at the size of the thumbnails on Fanfiction and what people are going to see, and how good does your cover image look when it's shrunk down to that size. Because if you can't distinguish anything, I had this problem with one of my stories, you couldn't distinguish anything with the title image, it just kind of looks like a smudge until you like blow it up to its full size, then it's not that good of a title image and people won't click on it. It's as bad, if not worse, than having no title image. You want one that just kind of pops with your title. Because sometimes you don't even see the description on Fanfic, you just see sometimes title image and that's it. And of course the description has to be alluring, like we were talking about that earlier in the panel, you need to treat it like your first sentence. It just has to grab people and suck them in. Do you have any tips on descriptions?
For descriptions, I guess as important as it is to deliver questions, you also really want to deliver information and let people know sort of the circumstances taking place in the story. I see a lot of synopses where author mostly just asks like an empty question and you don't really have any idea what the story is actually about. Those are a lot more popular than they should be, but frankly, I think a lot of people, it's a disservice to your readers in a sense in that you're forcing them to go in blind. You're not giving people a very strong idea of what's going to happen in the story.
Yeah, sometimes a really short description is all you need. Sometimes you need a couple of sentences like, Princess Celestia hates tea. Seriously, a lot. That's all you need.
But again, that's risky. It's probably safer to build up a bit of a readership for yourself before you go and do that.
Yeah.
And a reputation.
It's really hard to give general advice on this other than what we've already said, which sounds kind of vague because it's so situational from story to story. Because some stories warrant certain types of descriptions and you just have to know what works and what doesn't. Like, I guess like the Twilight shippick folder that I wrote, that seemed to be mildly successful because the descriptions like Twilight has been keeping Spike up because she's pulling all-nighters writing these things. Spike doesn't know what it is. Then he discovers it's horribly written shitfics of Twilight's friends, so Spike decides he has to plan to get back at Twilight, and that's basically all I give you, and that's enough to make people go, oh, I think I know where this is going, plunge into the fic. It's kind of funny. He actually, there's a flea market the next day, so he takes all of the shitfics and sells them for 10 bits each. And Twilight finds out.
It's a little out of character, but it was really funny.
Got some bits at the least.
Yeah.
What's the last thing on that one?
Oh, you read Celestia. Did you have a question?
Crap, I'm blanking.
That's all right. We'll come back.
It happens to the best of us.
And there's now that we've talked about that, I want to briefly mention FinFix, how their featured box works, because some people know it, some people don't. There's this hidden algorithm called Heat. And how Heat works, basically, it's this, no one knows the exact function except Nighty. Basically what it is, you have the amount of upvotes, the amount of, and then the upvote downvote ratio, the view count, and I'm not sure if favorites also plays into it, but each number is differently weighted, added up, and then it's divided by by time, like how old the fic is, and that's how your heat decays. And the top 7 heat are listed in descending order in the featured box. So the story at the very top of the featured box is the most popular news story on FinFic, and then the bottom 3 slots are always reserved for the top 3 most popular story updates based on heat, and it probably uses a completely different algorithm for that. So
incidentally, he keeps on changing up the code, so if you think you can game the system, don't even bother.
yeah, at one point you needed 4,000 words minimum to be featured, and now doesn't matter. They did that to combat these 1,000 word fics that kept dominating the featured box. I had 1 or 2 stories that were a hair under 4,000 not get featured simply because of that system, and then they changed it again.
It doesn't matter, but I think they take a small hit if they're under 4,000.
Oh.
Like length, I think length up to a certain amount will improve its odds a little bit because people don't go through harder to digest content as much. In regards to heat, don't try manipulating it in ways that you shouldn't be, because Nighty knows what he's doing, and he can, from a programming perspective, as a programmer, I can tell that Nighty knows what he's doing, and he will catch you.
Yeah, and you will
He
get
has caught a lot of people.
Yeah, like there
Pretty
are
much everyone who's tried.
Yeah, I've known people who would make 50 alternate accounts and then have those alt accounts upvote the story the second it gets published, and that would rocket it to the feature box. If you get like 30 upvotes and no downvotes in the first like 30 minutes of your story being out, that pretty much guarantees it a spot in the featured box, and then it snowballs from there. And the reason why the featured box is important is more views will breed more views will breed more views, and you'll just expand your fan base will just balloon. And there are other ways to get your story featured other than FinFic. You can post it to, FinFic groups. Like adding it to groups is like relevant groups only. It's really important if you have IRC channels or whatever you go to. You want to post it there. You want to post it to Reddit. All that sort of stuff when it comes out. And then there are the 2 publishers of the fandom, the Equestria Daily and the Royal Guard. The Royal Guard is a group on FinFic, and have you guys ever seen those fanfiction spotlight number whatever on the side posted by Obsolescence? Yeah, that's us. When we have like about 10 stories on a Thursday, we'll post like a chunk of them. But when your story is accepted, it gets added to that, and it will garner more views because some people will go, well, I don't have time to filter out the good from the bad, so I'm only going to read fics in the Canterlot Library and the Royal Guard and Equestrian Daily. And because those have been filtered by humans and not happenstance of the featured box, because there's a lot of trash in the featured box all the time. Yeah.
Especially if you leave mature on it.
Yes. Let's not talk about that. PG panel. One technique you can do is you submit it to EQD and have it unpublished, and then if EQD decides to run it, then when they say, congrats, your story's going to be run, you go, okay, time to hit the publish on FinFic, and then it goes up on FinFic New, then it goes on Equestrian Daily within the next day or so, and it gets double the view count, and it will almost guarantee you a spot in the featured box. That's one way to game the system, but it's tricky because you have to you have to have your story up to their standards.
Worth noting is that if you get it rejected from Equestria Daily, or anywhere for that matter, don't take it personally, because every writer out there in the real world has guaranteed a stack of rejection slips as tall as you are. So, and also, to address the elephant in the room, Equestria Daily is a spotlighting site, they're not a fanfiction site. And if they let through, these days, if they let through every story that is good enough to get published to to a reasonable standard, they just drown in the stuff. So it's really tricky, kind of dodgy getting on there. But don't let it bother you, if you get on, great. If you don't, well, there's the Royal Guard, and there's other ways to promote stuff, So it's, and oftentimes, you just got to accept sometimes a story will not be a hit. And they got there's this thing called magnum opus dissonance. You ever hear of that?
Yeah.
That's where you write these two stories, and one of them you think is, oh, it's my best work, they're gonna love it, and it's a cult hit at the best. Only a few people read it. This other thing that you just kind of slammed out for fun and kind of tossed it out there, shoots to the top of the heat chart and stays there for 3 days.
Yep.
Oh, I think Her Highness has a question.
As an artist, I can relate to that. I worked really hard on a digital art, full digital art, and barely any favorites on DeviantArt. Yet I do this really quick rare Jack sketch for a friend, just say for work, rare Jack sketch for a friend, because he requested it. Just, a little sketchy thing, really quick, and every week I'm getting 5 to 10 more favorites on that, just because people like that shit. And I'm like, don't even look at any of my other work. It's not even my best.
The various art forms out there, and of course, if there's an art form, bronies have turned it into a cottage industry. It's true, they have these things in common, that you're going to have a few bad apples among the critics, you're going to have fans of fans, that concept. You're going to have we've got critics, in this fandom, publishers, all sorts. And but the process of creating, even between these different art forms, there are so many similarities, as we have just seen. So hey, if you meet another artist, even if it's a totally different art form, there's a great conversation piece right there. Just man, away you go in my experience.
Yeah, people suffer from that. Penstroke suffers from magnum opus dissonance. Past Sins overshadows everything, and objectively, Past Sins is merely an average story. A part of the proof of this is the Pony Fiction Vault is a pretty good standard for what's good and what isn't. And Penstroke has a story called Creeping Darkness in there. Past Sins was in there, but it was not inducted into the vault under exemplary. It was inducted under popular, or
it's a classic.
Classic. And there are only 5 stories inducted under that. So, and that means they don't meet the vault standards, but they're forced to be in there just because of how popular they are. These stories are The Conversion Bureau, Cupcakes, My Little Dashie, Fallout Equestria, and Past Sins. Those 5 are not good enough to be in the vault, but are just because of how popular they are. And Penstroke has written better stuff than Past Sins, but yet that's all he's known for.
And by the way, don't get mad, he agrees with this.
He agrees with it, yeah.
Oftentimes, by the way, one thing you'll notice, and I noticed recently, is when you give constructive criticism to a creator, that creator, oh, he knows what I'm talking about, that creator will say, thanks, okay, I'll try and follow your advice. But sometimes the creator's fans will get all up in arms because you dared to criticize their hero. Meanwhile, they don't even pay attention to what their hero was saying thank you for the constructive criticism.
Like me on the Butler story. Yes,
For
Cam?
example.
I was about to ask Morris what's the part of his story. Who did you piss off this time?
Which, you'll have to narrow that down. I mean,
Who did you give critique to that got the fans riled up?
That was me.
It was
Gary's
Yeah, I was posting on the Butler story. I'm like, dude, you use like way too many adverbs. Your dialogue isn't even punctuated properly. There are guides. Look at them, use them, revise your story. And then all these people like jump down my phone. It doesn't have to have good mechanics to be popular. I'm like, you are why Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey are successful. And they didn't respond, just shut down.
yeah,
Discussion over.
It got kind of ridiculous. Every now and then you'll run into one of these guys who thinks he's too good to learn the right style and mechanics. And they'll actually write these diatribes about why and put all this effort in. And I'm thinking, man, what are you afraid of here? You know, somebody acting this way, that's not rational. You know, I don't know.
Yeah, but one thing about writing is we talked about all these different rules and different things you need to know, like all the rules of writing, like elements of style. That's just a rule book exclusively, and rules can be bent and broken. And there's a reason why. There's only one law in creative writing: it can't be broken, no matter what. Is if it works, it works. Period. That's it. And that's why rules can be broken and defined. But that's why rules were created, because that's generally what works. Generally.
I feel like something we haven't necessarily touched on much during this talk is sort of how to grow as a writer and ways that you can improve.
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
We're about at time, but we do have about 5 to 10 minutes to go over this, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A, and then at 1:15, is that good with you? Yeah. Okay, and then from between that and 1:15, we'll wrap up.
So there's a lot of what I try to do with my writing is every time I write something new, I push the boundaries in some way I haven't previously. And you're never learning faster than when you're in unexplored territory. So whether that's shifting genres or writing from a different perspective, writing in a different tense, there's a lot of ways you can sort of challenge yourself, and as long as you continue to challenge yourself, you should continue to improve. If you find yourself in the sort of situation where maybe you've been writing for 4 months or something, you're not learning as quickly as you want, or you're not improving as quickly as you once were, you don't feel like you're moving forward, something to do is just go into completely unfamiliar territory.
Yep. I wrote a story in first-person present tense. It didn't go well, but I did write a story in first-person present. That's usually suicide.
Worth noting is that if you're trying something you never have before, it's not going to work the first time unless you're really lucky or your name is Charles Dickens. You know, the first time you try anything is always just practice.
Yep. Practice makes great. Exactly, and that's writing is an art form, and like all art forms, like say if I wanted to get into drawing, like just drawing art, you know what I would do? I'd draw a stick man, and badly at that. And my first story, like my first attempt at a story, was the written equivalent of that, and I'll assume it's the same for everyone here. But you have to draw your 10,000 stick men before you start drawing the Mona Lisa.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
Do we have any questions?
Just in general or specifically about
It's general, because we're pretty much in a wrap-up phase. He had a question first, the gentleman in front.
For me, I seem to be like that one writer you mentioned.
James Joyce.
Yeah, I constantly try to think like, I'm trying to get better, but I constantly stop myself when I'm writing, like, oh, this doesn't seem to work, or why would it take, oh,
every single time someone
and it's been really rather tough to get those critics out of my head. Do you have any sort of advice at all for that?
Two pieces. Number one, work on a deadline. And that's one thing college has taught me, because it's like, okay, you have a 2,000 word story due by this date. You have to hand it in, and it's going to get marked. that really, lights a fire under your chair. And another is to, it's kind of a deadline thing, is to have your word minimum. If you want to agonize over every word, but you have a 1,000-word minimum a day, then you're going to come to this point where you're like, I've got to settle for less. And oftentimes your writing will feel more natural and less forced when you do that. I'm not saying throw quality to the wind unless you're one of those people who can just throw mud at the page and then turn it into something brilliant later. Some people do that, but just lower your standards enough so that you can write at a decent clip, and that way you'll, especially if you write daily, it'll keep you more engaged with the story, and your story will feel more organic, and that's important.
On the flip side, I am someone who is currently writing. As I've gotten better at writing, I've gotten slower at writing. I'm currently writing like under 750 words a day, which used to be my old daily minimum. And I find that a lot of what I do is, if I get stuck at a particular part, I'll put in brackets like, they fight and someone dies, and then I continue on somewhere else. Like just jumping around lets you sort of get over some humps.
That's a technique some people use.
One thing I like to do is, if I'm bogged down at one part, I like to skip ahead to another scene and just write the dialogue, because that's the fun part for me. And on a good day, I might write just a whole scene that's nothing but dialogue and a few, tags. And then when I'm feeling a bit more up to it, come back and fill in all the other stuff. Might consider trying that. May or may not work, but play around with it. The order of things, the technique. It really depends. So experiment, and you may find something that works.
Narrative is hard. Dialogue is easy, except when they aren't. I've gotten stuck on conversation sometimes, and then I just go and write narrative. It really depends on the mood you're in. I find that writing dialogue is a lot different than writing narrative, so if you're stuck on one, switch to the other.
One word of caution though, if you're writing something more complicated like a novel, it's a lot harder to jump around, at least in my experience. And I like to see the story play out in a more linear fashion, because when I write a scene later, I might come up with an idea in my current scene that just completely invalidates that scene and just puts all that time to waste. Since I'm not an architect, I just like to let it go organically. But again, it varies from person to person. In Stephen King's book, he mentioned this one writer who would write the same page 7 or 8 times before page 2, but once he finished his manuscript doing that, it was done. 100% done. He didn't have to rewrite anything beyond the 7 to 8 rewrites of each page.
One question regarding fanfiction seeds, because sometimes some people they won't read a fan who has a full season at all because they like some of the main characters. Sometimes there's maybe 1 or 2 seasons introduced within certain parts of the story. It's good. It depends on.
Well,
it's still about the main characters, though.
To use an example, I mean, my story, The Writing on the Wall, had Daring Do, Awizodal, and a whole big whack of OCs, because at that time it wasn't revealed that Daring was a canonical character, in the most direct sense yet. So, but that one, it had its fans. People have told me they come back to it and reread it every now and then, which is just the greatest ego stroke ever. Got published in a couple of places, and so in that case, those are incidental characters, not lead characters. And I think it's harder to sell an OC as a lead character.
Yeah.
My later story, Wildfire, I got permission to use the character of that name, the minor background character. Unfortunately, it was her plus a whole big whack of OCs, and very few people read it, but those who did liked it and said it was undervalued, you might say.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a line there somewhere.
I like to think of it as sort of a spectrum where at one end you have the main 6 and the main characters that show up like almost every episode, and the other end you have OCs. And in between there are side characters, background ponies. Yeah, and you can, I like Applejack. In between there, you can sort of blur between an area in the spectrum, but you don't really want to mix different ends of the spectrum too much, or at least not until several chapters in and you've gotten your readers comfortable.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier. It's just difficult to make a story with pure OCs work because of that. If you're writing a story about pure OCs, that's when you start thinking, should I just not write about ponies and just write my own original work instead? Because oftentimes that's the better course of action. Like when you put so much of your own headcanon into ponies too, it's just like, look, just stop writing ponies and try and actually sell your work, because you can't with fanfic.
It's not a question about OCs, but it's about actual characters.
Yeah.
How do you write them as well in character? Does it have to be the author's style of writing, how they write the characters, or just how they're presented in the piece of work?
Or is it just a question of like research? Because I've been thinking sort of the same thing.
You could just watch the show over and over. Yeah, that type of research I was talking about earlier.
Yep.
I find a lot with characters, I do something pretty drastically different from a lot of authors, which is I distance myself from characters immensely, which leads to me killing them very easily. Or doing horrible things and having them suffer. It really comes down to methodology. You don't really need characters to be exactly like they are in the show, it just has to work, like we were talking before. You could have a character act drastically different, like in his story, but it worked for the sake of comedy.
Worth noting is that there are a number of popular bloggers on Fanfiction who talk about various ways to write these characters and how to really get inside their minds. I think, well, I know Bad Horse has done this. I think Book Player does the same sometimes. And you know, do a little searching, you can probably find a few others as well. And they often say rather insightful things.
Yeah, I think I wrote some really terrible rambly blog post about my distance perspective on how I use characters at a distance.
Yeah, it's just like, what would this character do in that situation? The situation's going to be different from the show, but the reaction just has to feel authentic for the situation and the character. And the thing is, if you've written a longer piece, then you have the luxury of having the characters change. So even if it would be considered out of character, like, you know, in chapter 20, you've read the previous 19 chapters and seen that character go through this, you know, transformation, as it were. Because you generally don't want static characters. It's usually a bad idea to have them.
So the idea I'm having, basically the impression I'm getting here is what you were just saying about if it's not enough about the main cast, then you should probably not be writing ponies anyway. I'm having that doubt right now. But my main issue these days is world building. And I'm a person who likes internal consistency, and the world building has to make sense, but I get caught up in like, does it make sense? And the world, I have to build the world to a very fine detail before I can even feel like I can start writing. Now, do you have any advice with regards to that? As in, should I back off and chill a bit and just sort of leave things for myself, like gardener versus architect, like you were talking before?
Yeah, when I was doing Equestria from Dust, that sort of discarded a lot of the world from the show and recreated it in a way that I wanted to for the story. What I did for that was I just spent a lot of nights and days thinking it with it in my head before writing down a single word or a single note about it. I just thought on it, I thought on it, and I thought on it, and I thought about how, if Celestia was a sort of demigod character, like early on in the show you're sort of led to believe, you know, if she created the world from scratch, how would that work and how would that look? And that's what the entire story is. It starts with her on a desolate planet, and everything is built like within the story. So going through that, a lot of it was written a bit improvisational, but a lot of it was figuring out how to make original elements work into the story in a semi-plausible way.
Things that you know you need to work on, oftentimes you can work on them in the second draft, because then it's not so much a matter of trying to do everything at once as you build the story. It's more like you go and you find places and you fill in the blanks kind of thing. You know, I remember the tail end of the typewriter era. Who here remembers typewriters? Yeah, just a couple of people. No. Let me tell you right now, word processors are so much better because it's so much easier to go back and edit without killing trees.
Exactly. Yeah, the important thing from a reading perspective is the reader just needs to know enough about whatever situation or world or story so that they have something to hang on to, and then they'll learn kind of as you go. And as a writer, some people do need to have the whole thing just planned out, as I said, gardener versus architect, and if you're one, then just embrace it and don't hate. Like if you're an architect, don't hate on that you're an architect, just say, okay, I do need to plan this out, and that's just part of how it goes. And then, since you know everything about the world, you know exactly what to put in as you write the story. And as I said, second draft, or well, of course we said second draft. We said.
I also think when it comes to world building, that less is more in a lot of situations. I mean, a lot of the appeal of My Little Pony itself was that they gave us really good world and setting that we didn't know a whole lot about, and I do feel like that has sort of waned over the seasons as they flesh it out and make more things solidified in the world. And in a lot of ways, having a world where there's still so much unknown about it, and there's so much that you haven't said, but you've implied possibilities about how the world works, that can be a very powerful thing for world building. There's a lot that you don't have to say.
I usually have like an aversion to that, but the impression I'm getting is that at some level it has to just like embrace that and say there is sort of uncertainty. Because I have an issue with certainty versus uncertainty in this kind of thing. But I guess it's just pick a version of the thing you're trying to write and then just go with it.
It's a lot about uncertainty with being subtle and implicit. Is you just sort of have to do it and figure out where it does and doesn't work, and then in future stories.
Yeah, some of this advice may sound a bit repetitive and a bit cryptic because a lot of it is situational, but this is more of a closing statement because we are out of time, so after this we'll have to close, unfortunately. But basically, you just have to develop this instinct to know when something will work and when something won't, and a lot of that is just by hard work and experience and reading books on writing and just doing writing itself, and taking college classes can help with that. And yeah, it's just basically a lot, just instinct, and you develop that instinct by doing. And yeah, as I said, if it works, it works. Do you have anything to add to that? Anybody?
Hey, what do y'all think of my shirt?
What do it taste like?
Candy.
I'm going to try and find out.
Obviously it's candy.
I was inspired by my first story, actually. That was a simple conflict.
I think it was a mistake putting my Rainbow Dash over there.
It is barbecue season, you know.
No.
Well, that about concludes our panel. Thank you so much for attending, especially for those.
Thank you, audience. It was supposed to be a hand.
Also, we'll be back next year.